thought winter would save them. But winter saves no one. In the frozen dark, men fought not for glory, but for survival. They drove through blizzards, rebuilt bridges under fire, carried hope through snow and death. This was not a battle of weapons, it was a battle of will.
The weapon they could not see. Logistics in the frozen dark, January 3, 1945. Somewhere along the Bastogne, Houffalize Road, Belgium. The convoy moved through the darkness like a mechanical serpent. Headlights taped to narrow slits, engines growling low. 60 trucks, bumper to bumper, carrying ammunition, rations, fuel, medical supplies. The road was ice beneath fresh snow, treacherous, winding through forests where German snipers still lurked in the trees. The temperature was 8 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind cut like razors. Staff Sergeant Earl Washington, a black driver from the 666th Quartermaster Truck Company, gripped the wheel of his a half-ton truck and kept his eyes locked on the taillights ahead. His hands ached despite thick gloves. His feet were numb. Behind him, stacked to the canvas roof, were crates of 105 howitzer shells, enough high explosive to level a city block, enough weight to make the truck skid on every turn. This was the Red Ball Express in winter. This was the invisible war. The German planners who designed the Ardennes offensive had calculated many variables: troop strength, armor concentration, artillery support, air cover. But they had failed to account for one critical factor: the American logistical system, the vast, relentless machine that kept armies fed and armed even in the worst conditions imaginable. It was a fatal miscalculation. By late December 1944, the U.S. Army in Europe consumed approximately 800 tons of supplies per month. Every day, more than 26,000 tons of ammunition, food, fuel, and equipment had to move from ports in France and Belgium to front line units scattered across hundreds of miles. The system required thousands of trucks, tens of thousands of drivers, mountains of fuel, and coordination so precise that a single breakdown could ripple through the entire network. When the German offensive began, that system should have collapsed. Roads were cut, bridges were blown, supply depots were overrun or evacuated, communications broke down, weather grounded transport planes. The Germans expected chaos. They expected American units to run out of ammunition within days, to run out of food within a week, to simply stop functioning as coherent military formations. Instead, the system adapted. Quartermaster units rerouted convoys around blocked roads. Engineers rebuilt bridges under fire. Truck drivers like Washington drove 20-hour shifts, sleeping in their cabs, eating cold rations, navigating by instinct when maps became useless. The Red Ball Express, originally designed to supply the advance across France, pivoted south and poured supplies into the Ardennes. Within 72 hours of the German attack, more than 11,000 trucks were moving supplies to the threatened sectors. The numbers were staggering. Between December 16 and December 31, American supply units delivered to the Ardennes front 50,000 tons of ammunition, 35,000 tons of rations, 5 million gallons of gasoline, 18,000 tons of winter clothing and equipment, 5,000 tons of medical supplies. All of this moved through snow, through ice, through roads choked with retreating refugees and advancing reinforcements, through a combat zone where trucks were as likely to be hit by artillery as the tanks they supplied, and much of it was driven by men who were not supposed to be there. The Red Ball Express was predominantly staffed by African American soldiers, men from segregated units, men who had been told they were support troops, not combat soldiers, men who faced discrimination even as they risked their lives to keep the Army functioning. Drivers like Washington were given the most dangerous routes, the longest shifts, the oldest trucks. They were denied promotions and recognition. They ate in segregated mess halls and slept in segregated barracks. But they drove. They drove because they understood something the German planners did not. That logistics is warfare, that every bullet fired, every meal eaten, every gallon of fuel burned came from somewhere, delivered by someone. They understood that without them the front collapsed. They understood that their work was not secondary, it was essential. Washington's convoy reached Bastogne just before dawn on January 4. The trucks rolled into the town's shattered center, past burn, out buildings and shell craters, past exhausted soldiers who emerged from cellars and foxholes to unload the precious cargo. Ammunition crates were stacked beside artillery pieces. Ration boxes were distributed to company kitchens. Fuel drums were rolled to tank parks. Within 2 hours, the convoy turned around and headed back for more. Washington drove 36 hours straight. He did not complain. He did not stop. He simply drove. A German intelligence report, captured in early January, noted with bewilderment, American supply convoys operate at night, in blizzard conditions, on roads under artillery fire. Their losses are significant, but their capacity appears unlimited. We cannot interdict their logistics. We cannot starve them. This is not a military force in the traditional sense. It is an industrial nation, projecting power through machinery. The report was correct, but it missed the deeper truth. Yes, America's industrial capacity was immense. Yes, the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh and Chicago produced trucks and tanks and shells in quantities the Germans could not match. But the system worked not because of machinery alone. It worked because of men like Washington, men who drove through frozen nights, men who refused to quit, men who understood that their labor was a form of combat as vital as any battle. The Germans had planned for a war of will against will, of soldier against soldier. They had not planned for a war of systems, of logistics, of the grinding, relentless capacity of a democratic nation to organize and deliver. They had thought that cutting roads and destroying bridges would starve the Americans into submission. They were wrong because the Americans did not just deliver supplies. They delivered hope. Every truck that arrived meant ammunition to fire back, food to sustain strength, fuel to keep vehicles running. Every convoy that rolled through the darkness was a message: you are not alone, we are here, hold on. And the soldiers held. The moment of decision, when the weather turned December 23, 1944, 35,000 feet above Belgium. Colonel Clarence "Bud" Anderson, fighter pilot with the 357th Fighter Group, banked his P-51 Mustang into a hard left turn and scanned the sky. The clouds had broken finally, after a week of solid overcast, and the winter sun blazed down on a world transformed into a tapestry of white and shadow. Below, the Ardennes stretched out like a frozen map, roads threading through forests, villages clustered around church spires, columns of smoke rising from burning vehicles. And everywhere, German columns exposed. For 6 days, the Wehrmacht had advanced under the protection of winter weather. Low clouds and heavy snow had grounded Allied aircraft, giving German tanks and infantry freedom of movement. The Luftwaffe, in a rare show of strength, had flown hundreds of sorties in support of the offensive. The Americans, denied their greatest advantage, air superiority, had been forced to fight without close air support, without reconnaissance, without the devastating rain of bombs that had broken so many German attacks before. But on December 23, the weather changed. High pressure moved in from the Atlantic. The clouds lifted, the snow stopped, and the sky filled with American planes. More than 20 aircraft took to the air that morning. P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, B-26 Marauders, A-20 Havocs. They came in waves, filling the sky with the roar of engines, glinting in the sunlight like a swarm of metal locusts. They hunted for targets, tanks, trucks, artillery, supply columns, and they found them everywhere. Anderson spotted a column of German vehicles moving west on a narrow road, nose to tail, unable to disperse. He rolled his Mustang into a dive, lining up the lead truck in his gun sights. The 50 caliber machine guns roared, tracers stitching across the snow, punching through metal and flesh. The lead truck exploded, the column stopped. Anderson pulled up, circled, dove again. Rockets streaked from his wings, slamming into a half-track, blowing it apart. Behind him, his wingmen followed, strafing the length of the column, turning the road into a ribbon of fire. This was repeated thousands of times that day. American fighter bombers ranged across the Ardennes, attacking anything that moved. They destroyed 186 German tanks and vehicles on December 23 alone. They cratered roads, collapsed bridges, obliterated supply depots. They flew missions until their ammunition was exhausted, landed, rearmed, and flew again. Pilots logged 6, 7, 8 sorties in a single day, pushing themselves and their machines to the limit. The impact was immediate and catastrophic for the Germans. Panzer divisions, which had been advancing steadily, ground to a halt as their fuel supplies were destroyed. Infantry columns scattered into the forests, unable to move in daylight without being annihilated from the air. Artillery positions were silenced by dive, bombing attacks. The entire German offensive, which depended on speed and momentum, lost both. A German tank commander, captured on December 26, described the experience. "We heard them before we saw them. A sound like thunder that grew and grew until it filled the world. Then they were on us, screaming down, and there was nothing we could do. We could not hide. We could not run. We could only die. It was like the end of the world." The weather, which the Germans had counted on as an ally, had betrayed them. But the air campaign was not just about destruction. It was about supply. On December 23, the same day the fighters took to the air, the first major aerial resupply mission flew into Bastogne. C-47 transport planes, escorted by fighters, dropped 144 tons of supplies by parachute. Over the next 3 days, more than 850 sorties delivered ammunition, food, medical supplies, and reinforcements to the surrounded garrison. German anti-aircraft fire shot down several planes, but the missions continued. The supplies poured in. The contrast with German logistics was stark. The Luftwaffe attempted its own resupply missions, trying to deliver fuel and ammunition to forward units. But Allied fighters intercepted most of these flights, shooting down transport planes and gliders by the dozens. German air losses during the Battle of the Bulge exceeded 800 aircraft, a crippling blow to a force that could not replace them. The Wehrmacht which had once conquered Europe with combined arms, tactics, and air superiority, now found itself on the receiving end of the same doctrine. The Americans had learned, and they had built a force capable of executing air operations on a scale the Germans could no longer match. Eisenhower, observing the air campaign from his headquarters, remarked, "When the weather cleared, the battle was over. The Germans had one chance winter weather, and when it broke, they had nothing left." He was right. The German offensive, already stalled on the ground by stubborn American resistance, was shattered from the air. The roads that had carried the Wehrmacht forward became killing grounds. The forests that had provided cover became death traps. The winter sky, which had hidden the German advance, now revealed it to American eyes and American guns. The Germans had gambled everything on winter weather holding. When it did not, the offensive collapsed. But the lesson went deeper than tactics or weather. It revealed the fundamental asymmetry of the war. The Americans could adapt to any condition, could fight in winter or summer, in clear skies or storms, with or without air support. The Germans, by contrast, had become dependent on specific conditions. They needed bad weather to protect their movements. They needed surprise to compensate for their declining strength. They needed luck, and luck, as any soldier knows, is not a strategy. The human cost, what the snow buried January 10, 1945. Near Foy, Belgium, Private First Class Eugene Rowe, a medic with Easy Company 5, 106th Parachute Infantry Regiment, knelt in the snow beside a wounded soldier and tried to stop the bleeding. The soldier, a replacement whose name Rowe did not know, had been hit by shrapnel from a mortar round. The wound was bad. A jagged tear across the abdomen, intestines visible, blood pooling in the snow. The soldier was conscious, gasping, eyes wide with fear. Rowe worked quickly, applying pressure, packing the wound with gauze, trying to stabilize him long enough for evacuation. But there were no more bandages. Rowe had used the last of his medical supplies 3 hours ago. He had scavenged German first aid kits, had taken bandages from the dead, had improvised with torn cloth and belts, and anything he could find. Now there was nothing left. He held pressure on the wound with his bare hands, feeling the warmth of the blood against his frozen skin, watching the soldier's face go pale. "Stay with me," Rowe said quietly. "Stay with me." The soldier died 2 minutes later. Rowe closed the man's eyes, covered his face with a shelter half, and moved on to the next casualty. There were always more. This was the reality that no amount of logistics or air power could erase. The human cost of the Ardennes, measured not in statistics but in moments, in individual lives, in men who died alone in the snow, far from home. The Battle of the Bulge was the deadliest battle in American history, not just in total numbers, but in the nature of the deaths. Men froze to death in foxholes, too exhausted to keep moving. Men bled out from wounds that would have been survivable in better conditions, but in the cold, with limited medical supplies and overwhelmed aid stations, became fatal. Men were captured and executed at Malmedy. 84 American prisoners were murdered by SS troops, gunned in a field and left to freeze. The wounded faced particular horror. Medical evacuation in the Ardennes was a nightmare. Roads were blocked or under fire. Ambulances got stuck in snow or were destroyed by artillery. Aid stations, overwhelmed with casualties, operated in bombed-out buildings without heat, without electricity, often without anesthesia. Surgeons worked by candlelight, amputating frostbitten limbs, treating sucking chest wounds, trying to save men who should have been in hospitals, but instead lay on stone floors in sub-zero temperatures. Frostbite was a silent killer. By the end of the battle, more than 15,000 American soldiers had been evacuated for cold injuries. Some lost toes or fingers. Others lost entire feet or hands. Many would carry the damage for the rest of their lives: nerve damage, circulation problems, chronic pain. The men who suffered frostbite were not cowards or malingerers. They were soldiers who had held their positions in conditions that exceeded human tolerance, who had refused to retreat even as their bodies began to shut down. The psychological toll was equally severe. Combat in the Ardennes lasted weeks, with no respite, no rotation, no relief. Men fought day after day, sleeping in shifts, always cold, always hungry, always afraid. Shell shock, what would later be called PTSD, afflicted thousands. Some men broke, unable to function, staring into space, trembling uncontrollably. Others became numb, emotionally dead, going through the motions of combat like automatons. A few simply walked away, wandering into the forests, never to be seen again. The army tried to care for these men. Psychiatrists were sent to aid stations to treat combat exhaustion. Rest areas were established behind the lines where soldiers could sleep, eat hot food, and recover. But the demand far exceeded capacity. Most men returned to combat still shaken, still traumatized, still carrying the weight of what they had seen and done. Rowe, the medic, survived the battle, but he carried it with him always. Years later, interviewed about his experiences, he said, "People talk about the cold, about the Germans, about the fighting. But what I remember most is the faces, the men I couldn't save, the boys who called for their mothers as they died. You don't forget that. You live with it." This was the cost that the German planners had not calculated. When they designed the Ardennes offensive, they saw divisions and battalions, tanks and artillery pieces, abstract units on maps. They did not see the individual human beings who would suffer and die in the snow. They did not consider that the American soldiers they sought to break were not machines but men, men with families, with dreams, with the same capacity for fear and pain as anyone. And they did not understand that those men, despite their fear, despite their pain, would choose to endure. A soldier from the 101st Airborne, riding home after the siege of Bastogne, tried to explain, "I don't know why we held. It wasn't for glory or medals or any of that. We held because the guy next to you was holding, and you couldn't let him down. We held because going home meant getting through this, and the only way through was forward. We held because at some point you realized that you're stronger than you thought, that you can survive things you didn't think were survivable. The Germans thought winter would break us, but you can't break something that refuses to be broken." That refusal, more than any weapon or strategy, was what won the Battle of the Bulge. The counterattack. Winter as weapon, January 3, 1945. Chenagny, Belgium. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, stood in the turret of his M4 Sherman tank and surveyed the frozen landscape. Behind him, 30 tanks idled in a column, their engines rumbling, exhaust smoke white against the morning air. Ahead, the road to Bastogne stretched through fields and forests, marked by burn, stout German vehicles, and the frozen corpses of soldiers who had tried to hold the line. The relief of Bastogne on December 26 had not ended the battle. It had simply changed its nature. Now, instead of defending, the Americans were attacking. Instead of absorbing blows, they were delivering them. The objective was simple: drive the Germans back across the German border, destroy their forces, end the offensive once and for all. Abrams gave the signal, The tanks moved forward. This was the American counterattack, and it was executed with a brutality that shocked the Germans. The U.S. Army in January 1945 was not the same force that had landed in Normandy 7 months earlier. It had learned, adapted, evolved. It had learned how to fight in hedgerows, in cities, in forests. It had learned how to coordinate armor and infantry, how to use artillery in support of rapid advances, how to call in air strikes with precision. And now it had learned how to fight in winter. American tactics in the counterattack were ruthless and effective. Tank units advanced with infantry riding on the hulls, a technique borrowed from the Soviets that allowed rapid movement across open ground. Engineers followed, clearing mines and obstacles. Artillery fired rolling barrages ahead of the advance, suppressing German positions. Fighter bombers circled overhead, ready to strike any target identified by forward observers. The entire system moved like clockwork, grinding forward, overwhelming resistance through sheer firepower and coordination. The Germans, exhausted and demoralized, could not stop it. Wehrmacht units that had advanced confidently in mid-December were now in full retreat, abandoning equipment, leaving wounded behind, fleeing eastward in disorder. Entire battalions disintegrated. Officers lost control of their men. The vaunted panzer divisions, which had once been the pride of the German military, were reduced to scattered remnants, their tanks destroyed or out of fuel, their crews dead or captured. Abrams's task force drove deep into German-held territory, bypassing strongpoints, cutting supply lines, sowing chaos. On January 9, his tanks linked up with elements of the 11th Armored Division near Hufeleis, cutting the Bulge in half and trapping thousands of German soldiers. The encirclement was not complete. Many Germans escaped, but the damage was catastrophic. The Wehrmacht lost over 600 tanks and assault guns in the Ardennes, losses it could never replace. But the counterattack was not just a military operation. It was a statement. The Americans, who had been attacked in the midst of winter, who had been expected to break and retreat, were now advancing in the same conditions. They were proving that winter did not belong to Germany, that cold was not a German advantage, that hardship could be endured and turned into a weapon. The symbolism was not lost on the Germans. A Wehrmacht colonel, captured during the counterattack, told his interrogators, "We thought you could not fight in winter. We thought you needed comfort, warmth, luxury. We were fools. You fight better in winter than we do, because you are not broken by it. You adapt. You overcome. We glorified suffering, but you simply refuse to suffer. There is no defense against that." It was a profound admission, and it cut to the heart of the German failure. The Nazis had built an ideology around hardship, around the idea that suffering made men strong, that privation was a virtue. But suffering does not make men strong. It simply makes them suffer. The Americans understood this. They did not glorify hardship. They sought to minimize it through logistics, technology, organization. But when hardship was unavoidable, when the conditions exceeded human tolerance, they endured it not because they loved suffering, but because they loved what they were fighting for. That distinction mattered. The German soldier fought for an ideology that demanded sacrifice, that treated him as expendable, that valued obedience over individuality. The American soldier fought for a society that valued him, that tried to keep him alive, that promised him a future worth living. When both were pushed to the limit, the American had more reason to survive. By the end of January, the Ardennes had been retaken. The Bulge was eliminated. The German army was in full retreat, fleeing back across the Siegfried Line, abandoning Belgium, surrendering Luxembourg, giving up every inch of ground it had gained at such terrible cost. The winter offensive, Germany's last great gamble, had failed utterly. The reckoning, what the Germans lost February 1, 1945. OKW headquarters, Sachsen, Germany. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel sat at a long wooden table in the underground bunker complex south of Berlin and reviewed the casualty reports from the Ardennes. The numbers were staggering, almost incomprehensible. Total German casualties, 100 men, killed, wounded, missing. Armor losses, 800 tanks and assault guns. Aircraft losses, 100 planes. Fuel consumed, nearly 4 million gallons of irreplaceable gasoline. Ammunition expended. Stocks that had taken months to accumulate, now gone. For these losses, Germany had gained nothing. The offensive had advanced 60 miles at its deepest point, then been driven back to the start line. Antwerp had not been captured. The Allied armies had not been split. No political settlement had been achieved. The war would continue, and Germany was now weaker than before. Keitel knew the truth, even if he could not say it aloud. The Ardennes had not saved Germany. It had doomed it. The men lost in Belgium were irreplaceable. The Wehrmacht had committed its last reserves, its best remaining divisions, and had seen them shattered. There were no more panzer armies waiting in Germany. There were no more fresh troops to throw into the line. The forces defending the Rhine, the forces that would be expected to stop the Allied invasion of Germany itself, had been gutted by the Ardennes gamble. The armor losses were catastrophic. Germany's factories, operating under constant Allied bombing, could produce only a fraction of the tanks needed to replace those lost. Many of the destroyed vehicles had been Tigers and Panthers heavy tanks that took months to build and could not be easily replaced with inferior models. The few remaining Panzer units would have to be rationed carefully, husbanded for desperate last stands. The Luftwaffe was finished. The losses over the Ardennes, combined with ongoing attrition on other fronts, had destroyed its combat effectiveness. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Pilot training programs, already inadequate, could not replace the experienced aviators killed in the battle. The skies over Germany now belonged to the Allies, and there was no realistic prospect of changing that. But the greatest loss was psychological. The German military, which had once believed in its invincibility, in its tactical superiority, in its ability to overcome material disadvantages through skill and will, had been proven wrong. The Americans, whom they had dismissed as soft and inexperienced, had fought them to a standstill in winter conditions, had held when they should have broken, had counterattacked when they should have retreated, had won when all the variables favored Germany. The myth of German superiority was dead. Soldiers returning from the Ardennes brought with them stories that spread through the ranks, stories of American artillery that could level entire villages in minutes, of bombers that turned roads into graveyards, of supply convoys that operated with mechanical precision, of soldiers who fought with a stubbornness that bordered on madness. These stories demoralized troops who had not yet faced the Americans, who now understood that the war was truly lost. A German lieutenant, reassigned from the Ardennes to the Eastern Front, wrote in his diary, "We were told the Americans would break in winter. They did not break. We broke. We broke against their will, against their abundance, against their refusal to accept defeat. I do not know how to explain this to the men, How do you tell them that everything we believed was a lie? The truth was spreading, and with it, the collapse of morale. Desertions increased. Surrender rates soared. Entire units refused orders to counterattack, knowing it was suicide. The German army, which had once fought with fanatic determination, was coming apart at the seams. The soldiers still fought. They had no choice, but they fought without hope, without belief, simply to survive another day. The Ardennes had not saved Germany. It had accelerated its destruction. Hitler, presented with the casualty figures, flew into a rage. He blamed his generals for the failure, accused them of cowardice, of incompetence, of treachery. He ordered new offensives, impossible attacks, last-ditch stands that could not change the outcome. He retreated further into his bunker, into his fantasies, into the delusion that willpower alone could reverse military reality. But reality was closing in. On January 12, just days after the Ardennes offensive collapsed, the Soviet Union launched Operation Vistula, Oder, a massive offensive in the east involving over 2 million men. The Germans, having spent their reserves in the west, had nothing left to stop it. The Red Army advanced 300 miles in 3 weeks, reaching the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. In the west, the Allies prepared to cross the Rhine. With the German army weakened by the Ardennes, resistance was expected to be lighter. Plans were made for a final drive into the heart of Germany, a campaign that would end the war within months. The Ardennes had been Hitler's last gamble, and he had lost. But more than a battle had been lost. An idea had been lost, the idea that winter saved Germany, that hardship was a German advantage, that suffering made soldiers strong. That idea, which had sustained German military thinking for generations, had been tested in the snow-covered forests of Belgium and found wanting. The Americans had proven that winter was just weather, that cold was just temperature, that hardship was not a virtue, but a challenge to be overcome through preparation, logistics, and will. They had proven that abundance and strength were not opposites, that caring for soldiers made them fight harder, that a democratic society could produce warriors as fierce as any dictatorship. And they had proven it in the one place, at the one time, where the Germans had believed they could not fail. Final symbolism, the thaw, March 15, 1945. Remagen, Germany, the ice was melting. Along the Rhine River, great chunks of ice broke loose and drifted downstream, colliding and grinding against each other, the sound echoing across the water like distant thunder. The winter that had gripped Europe since December was finally loosening its hold. The temperatures rose. Snow turned to slush, then to mud. The world, frozen for so long, began to move again. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion stood on the western bank of the Rhine and stared at the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, one of the last intact bridges across the river, a steel arch structure that the Germans had planned to destroy but had not yet blown. "Take the bridge," his commander had said. "Take it before they drop it." Timmermann led his men across in a desperate sprint, dodging German demolition charges that exploded but failed to collapse the structure. They fought through machine gunfire, through sniper fire, through the fear that at any moment the bridge would disintegrate beneath their feet. But they made it. They seized the eastern bank. They held. For the first time since Napoleon, an army had crossed the Rhine into Germany from the west without having to build its own bridge. The capture of Remagen was a symbol, a moment that encapsulated the transformation of the American military from the desperate defenders of December to the conquerors of March. In 3 months, the U.S. Army had absorbed the most powerful German offensive of the war, had held against impossible odds, had counterattacked through winter, and had now broken into Germany itself. The ice was melting, the thaw had come, and with it, the end. Within weeks, American and British forces would cross the Rhine in strength. Soviet armies would encircle Berlin. The Third Reich would collapse into rubble and ash. The war in Europe would end, and the world would begin the long process of rebuilding. But the soldiers who had fought in the Ardennes would carry the winter with them always. They would remember the cold, the hunger, the fear. They would remember the friends who died, the wounds that never fully healed, the nights spent shivering in foxholes, wondering if they would see morning. They would remember what it felt like to be pushed beyond the limits of endurance, and to discover that those limits could be exceeded, that the human spirit could endure more than anyone thought possible. And they would remember the lesson of the Winter War, that hardship does not belong to any one nation, that suffering does not make right, that the strength of a society is measured not by its capacity to inflict pain, but by its capacity to care for its people even in the darkest times. The Germans had believed winter would save them. They had believed that cold and hardship would break the Americans, that ideology and will could overcome material reality, that suffering was a weapon that would deliver victory. They were wrong, because winter does not choose sides. It is indifferent, impartial, a force of nature that cares nothing for human conflicts. What matters is not whether you can endure winter, but what you are enduring it for. And the Americans, fighting in those frozen forests, were fighting for something the Germans had long since lost: the belief that every individual life has value, that abundance should be shared, that the purpose of a nation is to protect and nurture its people, not to sacrifice them. That belief, more than any weapon or tactic, was what carried them through. Epilogue: the fire that could not be frozen. April 30, 1945. Berlin. In a bunker beneath the shattered city, Adolf Hitler put a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger. The war in Europe ended 8 days later, but the story of the Ardennes did not end. It lived on in the men who survived, in the memorials built on frozen hillsides, in the lessons learned and passed down through generations of soldiers. It lived on in the understanding that winter is not a weapon. It is a test, and what matters is not the test itself, but what it reveals about those who face it. The Germans had glorified hardship, had built an entire ideology around the idea that suffering made men strong, that privation was virtue, that cruelty was power. They had believed that winter, that most German of seasons, would deliver them victory. But winter revealed only what was already there. It revealed that the Americans, these sons of abundance and democracy, carried within them a fire that no cold could extinguish, a fire lit by the belief that life should be lived freely, that people should be cared for, that prosperity is not shameful but earned, that a nation's strength is measured not by its capacity to inflict suffering, but by its capacity to prevent it. When the winter came, when the snow fell and the temperatures dropped, and the world turned white and silent and deadly, that fire kept burning. It burned in the foxholes where soldiers shared body heat and fought with frozen hands. It burned in the supply trucks that drove through blizzards to deliver ammunition and food. It burned in the aid stations where medics worked by candlelight to save lives. It burned in the hearts of men who had every reason to quit but chose to hold. And in the end, that fire was enough. The Germans had thought winter would save them. They had thought cold and hardship would break the Americans, that material superiority meant nothing in the face of nature's brutality. that ideology and will could overcome abundance. They learned otherwise. They learned that abundance is not weakness but strength, that caring for soldiers does not make them soft but makes them fierce, that a nation built on the principle that every person matters will produce citizens willing to fight and die to protect what they have built. They learned that winter does not save anyone. It simply tests everyone, and those who pass the test are not those who glorify suffering, but those who endure it for something worth enduring. The Battle of the Bulge was the deadliest battle in American history. It was fought in the worst conditions imaginable, in winter cold that killed as surely as bullets, in snow that buried men and erased roads, in darkness that lasted 20 hours a day. It was fought by young men who had never expected to be soldiers, who had been farmers and factory workers and students, who had been raised to build lives, not take them. And they won. They won not because they loved war or glorified violence. They won because they understood something the Germans did not, that the purpose of power is not to dominate but to protect, that the purpose of abundance is not to hoard but to share, that the purpose of freedom is not to escape responsibility, but to accept it. They won because they carried within them the fire of a democratic society, a fire that burns not with the bright, consuming rage of tyranny, but with the steady, enduring warmth of a people who believe in each other, who trust in each other, who will not abandon each other even when the world turns cold and dark. That fire, lit in the forests of the Ardennes in the winter of 1944, still burns. It burns in the memory of the men who fought there, in the stories they told, in the lessons they passed down. It burns in the understanding that freedom is not free, that it must be defended, that every generation must face its own winter and prove itself worthy of what it has inherited. The Germans thought winter would save them. Instead, it revealed the truth that winter saves no one, but that the fire of freedom, the belief in human dignity, in shared prosperity, in the worth of every individual, can burn through any winter, can endure any hardship, can outlast any tyranny. That fire cannot be frozen, and it will never die.